So now what we have in store for you is a pep talk. You know, how does it feel? If it feels good to contribute to a better internet. Much has been said about the active roles that we should assume in relations to internet governance once we leave. And Rodrigo is trying to pump you up, to motivate you, to get you to do that. So that you can get to know Rodrigo. Rodrigo de la Parra is a leading voice and advocate for multi-stakeholder internet governance models in Latin America and the Caribbean. Rodrigo is a regional vice president for ICANN, based in Mexico City, but frequently traveling throughout the region. He's responsible for outreach, support, and engagement with user groups, governments, private sector, and the civil society throughout the region. In his role, he works closely with Latin American technical communities to continue to build a robust internet infrastructure in that region. Under his leadership, ICANN has opened an engagement center in Montevideo, Uruguay, in the House of the Internet. He's got more than 20 years of experience as a multicultural executive, serving as a Director General of Prospective Regulation and Director General for International Cooperation of Mexico's Federal Commission of Telecommunications before joining ICANN in 2011. There's a whole bunch of things that Rodrigo has done. He's got a master's in political economy and international relations from Essex University in the UK. He speaks Spanish, English, French. We're going to stick to English, okay, in this crowd. Please give a very warm welcome to Rodrigo de la Parra.
I just want to say one thing about this.
Mira, so you know, how many people know Rodrigo? Okay, for those that you don't know, remember Siranuch yesterday that she talked about a fellowship program in ICANN?
Yeah.
He's an example of that.
Oh.
He started here in Puerto Rico in 2007 as a fellow, and now he's the vice president of global engagement in ICANN for the Latin American region. So that's a, you know, if you like to do what you like, you can do it.
Gracias.
Okay. So I don't have any presentation. I just want to have a very nice conversation, hopefully a pep talk. Hopefully I can convince you and recruit you to participate actively in ICANN or any other organization dealing with internet governance. And thanks, Eduardo, for this introduction and for highlighting this point as well. Because it has been an amazing journey for me personally. The first, you heard about the fellowship program. The fellowship program at ICANN is not only about getting financial support to go to a meeting. Of course, you will get, if you are a successful candidate, you will get the funding to go. They will pay you for your airfare, and they will pay you for your hotel. They will give you incidentals. But the best thing about the fellowship program is that it helps you navigate your first ICANN meeting. They can be really overwhelming. They can be really complicated. So if you're part of the fellowship program, at the end of the day, you will realize that the money support was the least important of the program. It also helps you to create this sense of community, of a really global community. I think I want to also highlight this point because if you are not into the global village, the world without borders, getting to know people from all around the world, getting to know other cultures, getting to have friends from all over the place, then probably this is not the right place for you to be, because the internet is global. And the organizations dealing with the internet are also and must be global. We should ensure they remain global. So this is perhaps a disclaimer, because if you want to be staying only in your city or your country or whatever, and not interested in doing other things, then probably this is not for you. But I suspect that everybody here in this room is up to new adventures, up to knowing new people. This is definitely a good start. Of course, there are other things that are important, but this is, I believe, the first step. And let me tell you a little bit about my experience and background and how I become part of this ecosystem. So I've been with ICANN for 7 years now, but before joining ICANN, I used to work for the regulator in Mexico, the telecom regulator. Regulators, I mean, at that time were actually really cool. They're still now, some of them, but at that time they were really cool because they were these market institutions that were fighting against the incumbent carrier, the big incumbent carrier that used to charge a lot of high rates to the users, very bad quality. So it was a very good solution back in those days, right? They say, well, the government should not be the one providing the services. It should be the private sector. There should be private investment. There should be competition, and for that we need a very lean, non-intrusive organization called a regulator. So I was very happy working for that. I was doing international affairs. As I said, very cool only from the telecom perspective. But then this new topic started to emerge, and it was about the internet, right? So. And for us, the regulators, we made let's say, a educated decision not to regulate the internet back in the 1990s. It was different than it is now. We decided not to regulate it from the infrastructure point of view. That meant that if you wanted to be an ISP, you don't need to apply to a license. You only needed the very most value-added services registration. That's what they call it in most countries, right? This by the way, happened also like a recipe to many countries and governments that adopted this idea of leaving the internet unregulated, but only from that perspective. But from time to time, this is late 90s, you will start receiving phone calls or people knocking at your door asking you about, well, maybe we need to talk because we want to have some sort of regulation from the internet. Well, what? I mean, you said no. And these were, for example, some kind of banks. I remember the banks coming into our office and say, well, you must be in charge of this because the internet sounds pretty much like telecommunications, so help us with this because we have this strange case of a bank doing fraud. But you know, this was the typical question of international law lecture, right? When they say, well, and tell us about this case. Okay, well, this is a bank in Costa. I mean, the ISP is based in Costa Rica. We know that because the domain name was registered in Costa Rica, but the user was from a Mexican bank. He was traveling to the U.S. He tried to make a transaction, and it was like a phishing kind of thing. But on those days, the phishing name it didn't exist yet. So we say, well, to be honest, there's not much that we can do because, as many of you know, in Latin American countries and probably in most countries that follow the civil Roman tradition of law, we cannot intervene unless we have a very clear mandate in the law that say you should do that. And of course, this was completely out of our scope. So we started to take a different approach and was pretty much learn about how the internet ecosystem was governed, right? You say the term internet governance instead of internet regulation. That's much better. Because that is the case. So started to participate in first ICANN meetings. ICANN started in 1998. My first ICANN meeting was in 1999 in Berlin. It was a very small meeting. Hopefully all of you, this is part of the pep talk. When you go and register to the ICANN meeting, please tell them that it was me that invited you. This will give me points for my bonus this July. I can invite you drinks or something, but please do. Just say, well, no, but go. I mean, this is a very different meeting. This is now a 2,000 meeting, probably 2,500 people attending the meeting. Back then, there was only perhaps 100 people or less than that attending the meeting. But it was very useful for me because I started to learn that it was not just about to go to yet another international organization or intergovernmental organization to try to solve a problem. Within my responsibilities in the Mexican regulator, as head of the international affairs area, we dealt with many organizations, mostly intergovernmental, like the ITU, like APEC. APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, has a telecommunications working group. The WTO has a component of telecommunications, so we were also involved, bilateral trade agreements with many countries, etc. So the OAS, many of them. But the scope of that is you will have a position paper from your government perspective only. You will go there and you have a specific training on how to be a diplomat, how to address the chair, how to address other delegates, and then you will finish the meeting, and hopefully you will go back to your country with a document signed by everybody. You had handshakes, and it was more or less easy to report back, right? But with ICANN, it wasn't like that. So first meeting they will say, okay, why are you going there? Well, I mean, we want to find out how this part of the internet works. It might seem to have some connection with our work in telecommunications because it has some similarities with numbering, right? With telephone numbering. So we say the IP addresses are doing something similar, and domain names they're kind of new, but maybe there's a connection. So we try to contact them. But I just went back home empty-handed, and they were saying, "So what happened? What did you do? Was Berlin fun?" Yeah, it was nice. You see many other countries, governments were not very well engaged at that time, so probably only 20 of them were there. Now we have close to 175 government countries sitting at the GAC. But that took us some years to achieve. So not even for networking was it valuable. So it became very more complex and more complex and more complex to justify why the Mexican regulator or the Mexican government needed to go and attend this meeting. But in the meantime, we started to realize that we were learning something from this, from the interactions of the different groups, right? So governments were just one part of the equation, but on the other room there were technical people discussing technical stuff, and in the other room there were some what started to become, not at the first meeting, but perhaps after 10 meetings, there was another group discussing the users' needs, and on the other room there were a group of business folks discussing business. So, and the interactions between those groups is what really make the difference in the making, right? So this is perhaps another good message that you can take back from internet governance capacity building. So it is about doing. It's like gymnastics, right? You need to exercises, and then you are doing internet governance, right? It's not about signing, it's not about agreeing in one single piece of document, it's about interacting with folks, it's about learning from others, it's about being empathetic about the needs of everybody that is connected and helpful to the internet. So they started to realize that it would have been a good idea to attend to these meetings, and then we had a very huge conference organized by the UN, which maybe you have heard a lot of that, which was the World Summit on the Information Society. We started to have some preparatory meetings back in 2001, regional preparatory meetings, 2002 as well, and then finally in 2003 and 2005 the summit takes place. And I believe that was a time when this thing of internet governance really exploded, right? Before this meeting, there were many other meetings about internet for everybody. That was a concern long time ago. So the task was dealt mainly by ministries of communications, right? Or regulators dealing with infrastructure. The task was to build as many infrastructure as they could to provide internet for everybody. But this summit was a bit different. This summit was different because it was to exceed the infrastructure only scope. It was to include also the content part, the education part, how to make use of the infrastructure, right? Because having universal infrastructure of internet is and was only the tip of the iceberg. Back then, there was a huge issue. It still remains. It has changed a little bit, but it was about the language. It was only English language. I will say, well, even if you are able to get connectivity to villages in Mexico, to villages in Latin America, you won't be able for them to use it. It won't be relevant for them. They were sometimes in this analysis using the example of the broadcasters, right? Radio and TV stations. Radio and TV stations at that time had achieved something that the internet was challenged to do. No matter where you go, right? If you turn on the radio set or your TV set, you are going to listen to content that is relevant to the local communities. And they use it on their day-to-day lives. Probably that's something they do first things in the morning. And this was the challenge for the internet. I mean, of course, the radio and TV sets, they still hadn't, and they still don't have the interactivity that the internet has and the potential. But that challenged the internet in many respects. So that summit was also about how to help communities have local content, create content relevant for them, for their activities. And this was already a very good attempt, right? So long story short, the summit went really well. Of course, it raised a lot of questions, even within the governments, starting from even from the UN perspective, right? Even from the UN perspective, they were questioning which UN agency should be leading these discussions. And it was the ITU, and the ITU is devoted also only to infrastructure. So UNESCO raised their hand and say, hey, so this is also about education, this is also about science. We have a remit, and other 3 or 4 UN agencies also raise their hands and say, well, we have a remit here and we need to be included in these discussions. But they were still struggling with that at that time, and I think that they came to an excellent solution. I will tell you about it now, and probably you've heard also about it. But also, so it was at the UN level, international organizations level, UN level. Nationally is who's going to be heading the delegation. Normally it was ICT regulators or ministries, because they had been discussing this for a long time. But from time to time you will hear ministries of science and technology, ministries of education also trying to jump into the train and make participation. So that also became important. But we thought we were over and done with this discussion, and we arrived to these preparatory meetings and then we found out that there were much more people and organizations that were concerned about how we should shape the future of the internet. And we're not talking of governments, we were talking of civil society organizations, we were talking of business. We were talking of many other people or groups of people that wanted to be part of these discussions and did not have a place on that table to discuss this, right? So this was really bad, and this was really discouraging, right? So these people will try to approach governments to say, and this is where the concept of friendly governments started to emerge. So these were governments that were realizing that even within them, and if they were coordinating perfectly within the same government, they wouldn't have the tools or the answers to solve the problems that needed to be solved in that summit. So they started to think maybe we should start having some different kind of approach. And that's the moment where, you know, the real discussions about multi-stakeholder governance of the internet started to have some kind of a form, or it become more concrete. ICANN was very handy at the time, and let me tell you why. I mean, this is of course a commercial. If you go to the ICANN meeting, please tell them that I told you this. Again, that can be helpful for me. No, the ICANN was already multi-stakeholder, right? Dealing with a very small yet very important part of internet critical infrastructure or internet unique identifiers. But it was a very good example of how an organization dealing with topics in a multi-stakeholder model could come to relevant outcomes. This is really important, and still is. You are going to be able to see. By the way, who hasn't gone to an ICANN meeting yet? Okay, this is good. So you have it just here. You cannot escape. Hopefully you attend. But you are going to be able to see all of these interactions. This is a very good example. Don't get misled. This is not dealing with internet governance topics, but it is, in my opinion, one of the most mature bodies dealing with multi-stakeholderism. So even from the perspective of political science, it's really interesting to see these interactions. So back to the WISES, that's the way people started to realize how important it was to have this kind of dialogue. Because, as I said, even if the governments were empowered to do it and had the were empowered to take care of internet governance, they wouldn't be able to do it because they didn't have the answers, they didn't have the knowledge to operate it, they didn't have all of these things. So I think many of them open up to a new dimension of cooperation globally with other governments, but also with other stakeholders at the local level and at the international level as well. But well, the summit went really well. There were only two issues that were contentious. One issue really not contentious, but all of the many of the tracks were about building infrastructure, building awareness, and trying to have all of the people connected to the internet. And they realized that for that they needed a lot of money. So they would say, okay, we agree on that, but how are we going to fund this infrastructure? And the problem was even more acute because at that time, I'm telling you that the governments just stopped being providers. They stopped being the stakeholder that was building the infrastructure in the countries. They said, now was the private sector. So how to stimulate the growth of infrastructure to promote access, broadband access to all of the communities. And they realized the size of the problem. And the size of the problem was that the world was becoming into a new definition of a division of not only income, but information, right? You get the info poor and info rich. The digital divide was growing, right? And they needed to do something about it to solve it, but with different tools. So finance was one problem. But the other problem was internet governance, right? They thought, well, now we think there is a problem. At that time, of course, they didn't know what all of the problems of internet governance were going to be, as we have now. There were very few. Some of them back then involved ICANN. This organization was used as an analysis of some of the problems that could affect internet governance and the principles. And speaking of the principles, that was mainly the outcome coming out from the WISIS in 2003 and 2005. So, of course, we spent a lot of time discussing this with other governments, with other civil society folks present here and there. But we came out with some generally agreeable principles, which are the ones that I believe you have been listening in these last couple of days. So, the principles of openness. So internet governance should be open, democratic, transparent. At that time, it was relevant to say multilateral. And I explain this in a second, but also with the participation of everybody. That was a big win for the internet. That was a big win because at the very beginning, when people were starting to discuss internet governance in a very structured way, the first outcome included this part of multi-stakeholderism, and this is now a globally accepted concept. That, on one hand, gives us, a breath of fresh air because it gives us peace of mind. But at the same time, I hope this is pep and not threat. It creates on us a lot of obligation. We need to keep it that way. And honestly, there's a lot of story to count after the WISIS, and I don't know if I'm going to have time. But believe me that it has now become even more evident that the internet needs all of us in all our own, let's say, action, right? So if you look at the the title of the talk, it said something about collaborative, right? Collaboration, coordination. And all of us, even if you don't think, all of us and collaborate only as being users of the internet. We collaborate to the internet. So the internet is a collection of networks. You have heard the term network of networks, I'm pretty sure. And this is not to say it's a big network, right? The network of networks. No, it's really a network that is built up of many networks. This is the key feature of the internet. It was designed that way, in an open architecture form, so that every network can connect to this other network. But that also means that all of us, I mean, every single user that's being added to the internet adds value to the to the network. So this is a principle of network economies. It worked for telecoms as well, but for the internet is particularly acute, because think about the potential. I mean, it's a potential customer, it's a potential audience, it's a potential producer, it's a potential seller. So adding one is great. So if you use it, you are contributing. If you are generating content or producing a blog or sharing or something more, then you are contributing more. If you work, let's say, in one of the organizations that make the internet work from a technical point of view, if you work for an ISP, security company, if you are doing research in academia regarding the internet, you are doing even more. But then the second, I mean, no, the latest or the more important thing is for you to contribute actively to try to maintain these principles of the internet. Because we should not give the internet for granted. Let me tell you this, I mean, we like the way it is. And I'm sure that there's no one in this room that could conceive a life without the internet. Not anymore, right? I mean, not even us as users, but the big, large corporations, right? But the internet can be at risk, right? These principles, I mean, perhaps amongst us, we all share these principles. We're happy with these principles, but there are people, there are organizations, there are governments that they are not happy with the current arrangements of internet governance. This is something true, and I think the way to overcome this, let's say, threat and turn it into a great opportunity is actually by participating in as much as you can. Now, how to participate? There are many opportunities. I'm, of course, using my ICANN hat, and I invite all of you to attend the meeting. I said this before. But there are other ways that you can contribute. There are Internet Society chapters in the countries where they are connected amongst them. They do also a lot of good stuff. There are technical bodies, if you're interested in that. And as you can see from the next panel, you're going to learn about capacity building initiatives that can help you understand how to participate better in each of these bodies that make the internet work, or that help us with internet governance. So how much time do I have left, Eduardo?
Is there master of ceremony?
Okay. So let me tell you now a little bit more about ICANN, right, as a body for discussing internet governance and how you can participate. I know that my boss was here, and he explained this a little bit, and I think you're going to learn more about the different structures of ICANN, right? But let me tell you a little bit of history about ICANN and how it has evolved, and how you can make a good participation even if you are a newcomer, right? So remember I told you about the world multilateral in one of the outcomes of the WSIS. And sometimes you're going to hear that they put the term multilateral against the term multi-stakeholder, as if they were opposites, right? But this is a slightly misunderstanding. because they need to understand why it was agreed to include both on the same paragraph of the documents that emerged from NASIG. So at that time, ICANN was the only organization, right, that existed, that had a remit on the internet, because one of the principles of the internet is that it should work on a distributed way, on a coordinated way, without the need of an institution or organization that can help it work. ICANN was needed and still is needed, and even before ICANN, there was a need to have a central coordination to manage the internet unique identifiers, right? So if you have 70,000 or 100,000 ICT networks or telecom networks, and you want them to become just one network, you need to have some sort of an identifier that will make them look as just one network, just as the internet works now. And that's where the IP addresses come. IP addresses are what make that the different networks will come and look only as one, right? And for that, well, you perhaps heard about this concept, but IP addresses are too long and very hard to understand for the users or to remember. So they came out with a system which was easier for them, which is the domain name system, right? The DNS. So the DNS translates the IP addresses into domain names, which are easy to respond. You don't go out in the street and say, ask a friend, do you mind giving me your IP address? Now it's even more complicated, because IP addresses in the IPv4 protocol are shorter, and they were already very complex. But now if someone asks you for your IPv6 address, it's more complex. And if they answered that question, they are definitely geeks, and they work for an RIR or something like that, because these are very long numbers. But you can ask them about your email address, right? Your email address also has an IP addresses related to it, because they have a domain related to it. Same as when you type a domain name. And for that, you need central coordination. And for that, you need a central body that can take part of that. And this is where ICANN came into place. So, to be honest, from a technical point of view, it's not really rocket science. I mean, this could be handled by a very small group of people located anywhere. You need some technical people, perhaps 10, 15 engineers very well endowed, and then some lawyers to take care of the interactions with the domain names and compliance and contracts and things like that, and that's it. But there's one slight problem. It's not a problem, but it's actually one of the inventors of the DNS used to say that that was the Achilles heel of the internet, because it required central coordination, which was against the open and distributed contribution to the internet. So they say, well, the way that we're going to solve this function is that we need to do this on a multi-stakeholder way, with the participation of everybody, or with a bottom-up approach of decision making, and that is why ICANN is as big as it is now. And it should be bigger. I mean, not in size of the staff that's taking care of these functions, but me and my colleagues are responsible for other things that make this multi-stakeholder model work, right? And that's that is what you're going to see next week. You're going to see many rooms full of people with interpretation booths discussing a lot of things and topics that perhaps you're not going to be able to understand, many acronyms, but you know, that is why you will find that the initiatives of schools in internet governance are very helpful for that. And the programs, like the fellowship programs, or you can sign up as a newcomer at ICANN, and they will, you know, people from the community will try to reach out to you and try to make your experience less traumatic. But at the same time, you will find out that what's happening in there is big. I mean, there's something important happening, because then you will realize that this is just the first meeting of the year, and we are rotating The next meeting will happen in Panama, and the next meeting will happen in Barcelona, and then we'll go to Kobe in Japan, to Morocco in Africa, and then back into North America in Montreal. So please come to the meeting. Reach out to anybody. If you see people wearing this kind of badge with a blue label here saying I can work, reach out to us. We are there to help you, and we'll be happy to receive you. The ICANN and the ICANN multi-stakeholder model needs diversity. I'm sure you already heard about the ICANN transition. But now what we need is to improve our multi-stakeholder model. We need people from for all of the regions and being active participants. I think I will stop here, and there's some time, I think 5 minutes for some Q&A. So thank you very much for listening.
Do we have any questions for Rodrigo?
My name is Jose Medina. I'm a professor. The ICANN process, as a result of the ICANN process, you come up with certain guidelines. How are these guidelines enforced?
Okay, good question, because unlike other organizations dealing with internet governance, ICANN has outcomes, right? And these outcomes, we call them policies, right? In ICANN, what the machinery and the interactions with the different stakeholder groups, we have a process that's called the PDPs, Policy Development Process, and we finally come out with processes which are they are guidelines, because they are not regulations, right? This kind of, if you want to talk about the legal dimension, it's more like soft law. But some of these policies affect contractual relationships, and those have contracts. And these contracts are completely legally binding. For example, the operation of registries and registrars, right, of domains. They have contracts amongst them. They have contracts with ICANN. I have to say, for you to understand, that we're talking about the generic domain names, right? .com, .net, .org. The CCTLDs, what we call them, like .pr, for example, they don't have a binding contract and relation with ICANN. They work on a voluntary basis. But they do have policies. They adopt systems to solve controversies. So it depends on the type of outcome that you might have under the process, but they are policies, and we have, if they imply the contracted parties, they are fully enforceable. Others are the result of the agreement of the many people that are involved in the solving of these problems. So this is what makes it really strong and different. Once they are out, they potentially can be contested, but we arrive to all of these decisions in a consensus way. So it's harder for anybody to contest something that they were involved in designing, right? But we do have now, even more after the transition, a newly designed way of contesting decisions of the board. We have more review mechanisms. So in case any affected party is not happy with the result, there are many ways of participating and trying to change the things. It's a complex machinery, but it's the community spent more than 2 years thinking about the best way of solving these problems if they arise.
Any more questions?
Let me say something about the enforceability of stuff.
Okay.
When you come from the regulatory world and you create a regulation and you shove it down, it's a top-down decision that's simply a command and control decision with little support from the community. It will probably be changed when another party comes around into government. Multi-stakeholderism is tough. It's sitting down, having long meetings, having long teleconferencing, having multiple points of view, but it's it's hard work to come to socialized, agreements. That's what gives them their strength. And they take a long time sometimes, but I would say it's like the best form of democracy. Really taking into consideration all those varied viewpoints and somehow striking a level of consensus that will give them their own stability in time. And then, well, legally it becomes binding through contracts and stuff. But really, what makes them binding is the deep level of agreement that they have within themselves.
My name is Marilyn Cade. Maybe your role model of remembering to introduce yourselves when you speak.
And if you go to the ICANN meeting, you will be able to listen to Marilyn in the public forum saying exactly this introduction. So don't miss that too.
I'm going to make a follow-up comment because I worked for AT&T, but in the, I helped launch AT&T Computer Systems and AT&T WorldNet. So both in the unregulated part of the industry. But you can't work in the world's biggest, at one point, communications company and not really know a lot about regulation. In the part of the world that business comes from, we primarily assume, the non-regulated parts of business, we primarily assume that governance is going to be by contract agreement from business to business, right? One of the things that's very interesting about ICANN is you need to remember that every one of the GTLD operators and the registrars voluntarily agreed to enter that business. So ICANN is not forcing something on them. ICANN is giving them a self-governance model that actually protects them, if I can shelters them, maybe that's a better word, from a lot of different regulatory mechanisms that if they had to deal with regulation in every country that they wanted to do business with, we would not have the diversity of registries and registrars. So when you come into ICANN, and you will hear some of the contracted parties being particularly negative about the burden of how much time to develop the policy or the money spent on compliance, keep asking yourself and talk to people like the two, Rodrigo, and also, think about how much more flexible this environment is than if it were a heavily regulatory environment. And I think that's one of the beauties of, and why it's so important for you to become actively engaged in policy development and immediately. The geo-names area is a beautiful area to become involved in very early.
Any other question?
So that being said, we would like to call some people forward so they can form a panel of discussion that can allow us to further this discussion. So for that panel, Rodrigo is going to be our moderator, and we would like to call Anja, Gengo, please, I'm sorry. And I'm sorry, but I need to make this. I had all these bios here and now. Okay. Anja, if you can please take a chair. Anja currently works with the United Nations Secretariat for the Internet Governance Forum, IGF, as a focal point for national, regional, and youth IGF initiatives. Prior to joining the IGF Secretariat, she worked as a legal analyst at a law office in Bosnia and Herzegovina. She is one of the co-founders of the Center for Media Law, where she worked as an internet policy analyst and program coordinator. Ms. Gengo is a 10-year experienced debater, trainer, and judge for the Karl Popper and British parliamentary debate formats, and a winner of many national and international debate-related tournaments. She holds a bachelor's degree in law and a master's degree in international law.